Something strange about the open road, especially at night. Maybe it's the endless darkness stretching out into nothingness, or the way the truck stops flicker in and out of sight, offering a strange sense of isolation. For truckers, life is measured by the mile, and the road often feels like a second home. But for Jake Warner, the road was about to become a place of unimaginable horror. Jake had been a trucker for over 15 years. He loved the solitude, the feeling of freedom that came with barreling down endless highways with only his thoughts for company. But after years of crisscrossing the country, Jake had started noticing things, small, odd occurrences that didn't make sense. It all began on a late October night, the kind of night where the fog rolls in so thick it feels like you're driving through a dream. Jake was on a long haul from Nevada to Colorado, driving along a stretch of road that he knew like the back of his hand. His destination was still a few hours away, and fatigue was creeping in. The glowing neon sign for a truck stop appeared out of the mist, and Jake decided to pull over for a quick break. He needed coffee, and maybe a chance to stretch his legs. The truck stop was one of those anonymous, generic places, clean enough but without much character. A few trucks idled in the lot, their drivers likely asleep in their cabs. As Jake walked inside, a strange chill swept over him, but he brushed it off as the wind. The place was empty, except for a tired-looking cashier sitting behind the counter, staring at an old television set. Static crackled across the screen, the sound somehow unnerving in the quiet of the night. The cashier didn't even look up when Jake entered. Jake wandered the aisles, grabbing a cup of coffee and a few snacks for the road. Something about the truck stop felt wrong though. The aisles seemed too long, the fluorescent lights flickering just enough to make him feel uneasy. The air was thick, almost oppressive, like the place itself was watching him. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog from his brain. As he approached the counter to pay, Jake noticed something odd. There were no windows in the truck stop. Not a single one. He could have sworn there had been windows when he pulled in, but now, all he saw were bare walls. The cashier's face remained emotionless as he rang up Jake's items, his fingers moving sluggishly across the register. "Long night?" Jake asked, trying to break the eerie silence. The cashier finally looked up, his eyes hollow and dark. "Every night's long around here," he muttered, his voice almost a whisper. Jake forced a smile, paid for his things and hurried back to his truck. As he climbed into the cab, he noticed something strange. The other trucks were gone. The lot, which had been partially full when he arrived, was now completely empty, save for his own vehicle. The fog had thickened, swirling like ghostly fingers around the edges of the truck stop. Jake felt a growing sense of unease. Something wasn't right. He decided to get back on the road as quickly as possible. As he shifted the truck into gear, the headlights cut through the fog, illuminating the deserted highway. But as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. An hour passed, then two. The highway was unnaturally quiet, no other vehicles in sight. The radio had fizzled out into static, the same unsettling noise that had been playing on the cashier's television. Jake kept glancing in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. But the road behind him was empty. Just as he was about to dismiss his paranoia, he saw it, an old beat-up truck tailing him. Its headlights flickered weakly, and the grille seemed to be rusted and worn, as though the truck had been abandoned for years. Jake's heart raced. He hadn't seen any other vehicles for miles, and the truck hadn't been there a moment ago. The strange truck followed him closely, its engine growling like a beast in the night. Jake pressed his foot harder on the gas pedal, trying to put some distance between them, but no matter how fast he went, the truck stayed right on his tail. Its headlights grew brighter, almost blinding, as though it were ready to swallow him whole. Suddenly the CB radio crackled to life, a voice cutting through the static. "You can't run forever, Jake." Jake's blood ran cold. He hadn't used the CB radio in hours, and he hadn't told anyone his name. His grip tightened on the wheel as the voice continued. "We've been waiting for you. Welcome to the endless road." Panicking, Jake tried to make sense of what was happening. Was this some kind of twisted prank? Or was he losing his mind? He glanced at the GPS on his dashboard, but the screen was blank. No signal, no map, just a black void. The highway stretched out endlessly before him, the fog growing thicker with every mile. The truck behind him surged forward, ramming into the back of his rig with a sickening crunch. Jake swerved, trying to maintain control, but the phantom truck rammed him again, harder this time. His heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to keep the truck on the road. His eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, and that's when he saw it. There was no driver in the pursuing truck. It was empty, a ghostly machine with no one behind the wheel. The voice crackled through the CB radio again. "It's time to stop, Jake. You can't escape." Desperation clawed at Jake's mind. He needed to get off this highway, but there were no exits, no signs, nothing but an endless stretch of asphalt winding through the fog. The ghost truck rammed him once more, and this time Jake couldn't recover. His rig skidded off the road, the wheels screaming against the pavement as it careened into the ditch. The truck lurched to a stop, the engine hissing and sputtering. Dazed, Jake fumbled for the door, his hands shaking as he stumbled out of the cab. The fog closed in around him, thick and suffocating, and the sound of the phantom truck's engine grew louder, closer. Jake turned to face the highway, but the truck was gone. The road was empty once again, the eerie silence wrapping around him like a shroud. But Jake knew better. He could feel it, something was watching him, something hungry and malevolent. The CB radio in his cab crackled to life one last time, the voice cold and final. "Welcome to the road, Jake, you'll never leave." As the fog swallowed him whole, Jake realized the terrible truth. The truck stop, the highway, the ghost truck, they were all part of something far more sinister, a trap set for those who roamed the roads too long, those who thought they could outrun their demons. But on this road there was no escape, and Jake Warner would be driving it forever. And so if you ever find yourself on a lonely stretch of highway in the dead of night, be careful. Because some truckers never make it home. Some truckers like Jake are still out there, trapped on the endless road, pursued by something far worse than the darkness. Jake's breathing came in short, panicked gasps as he stumbled through the thick fog, each step heavy as if the ground beneath him was pulling him down. His legs trembled, his heart pounding against his ribs like a wild animal trying to escape. The silence surrounding him was deafening, the only sound coming from the fading hiss of his truck's engine. He turned back once, hoping for a glimpse of his rig, but it was already swallowed by the mist, leaving him completely alone. The road was gone. The landscape was gone. Everything was gone. He fumbled for his phone, the comforting glow of the screen his last tether to reality. But the signal was still dead, the screen showing only the mocking icon of no service. Desperation gnawed at him. This couldn't be real. There had to be an explanation, a glitch, a prank, maybe even a hallucination from too many hours on the road. But deep down he knew none of that was true. Something had dragged him here, and it wasn't going to let him go. Suddenly, a low rumble echoed through the fog. Jake froze, his pulse quickening as he strained to listen. The sound was distant at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder, closer, like the growl of a beast stalking its prey. His stomach twisted in fear. It was the same sound he'd heard just before the phantom truck appeared. Another truck was coming. Without thinking, Jake sprinted forward, his boots slamming into the ground as he ran blindly through the fog. The growling engine grew louder, closing in fast, and he knew that if he looked back, he'd see the headlights, those terrible glowing lights that chased him through the night. But there was nowhere to run. He skidded to a halt as a figure loomed ahead of him in the fog. It stood motionless, a dark silhouette barely visible in the swirling mist. Jake's breath caught in his throat, his mind racing. Was it another trucker? Someone who could help him? "Hey!" he called out, his voice hoarse and cracking. "Help, I'm stuck out here." The figure didn't move. Jake took a cautious step forward, his heart pounding harder than ever. As he approached, the shape became clearer, and a wave of cold dread washed over him. It wasn't a person, it was a sign, a rusted, weather-beaten road sign, its letters faded and barely legible. Jake squinted through the fog, trying to read it. His pulse quickened as the words became clear. "Trucker's graveyard, no way out." Jake's stomach dropped. His mind spun, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. It had to be a sick joke, some twisted prank played by locals to scare drivers off the road. But the sign stood there, unwavering, a grim sentinel in the endless fog. And then he heard it again, the rumbling engine, now impossibly close. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Headlights pierced through the fog, growing brighter and brighter as the truck barreled toward him. But this truck was different. It was ancient, rusted beyond recognition, with shattered windows and a gaping hole where the driver's seat should have been. And yet, it moved with a terrible purpose, its tires screeching against the invisible road. There was no driver. Jake stumbled backward, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, but his body was frozen in terror. The truck thundered closer, its broken headlights casting jagged beams of light through the fog. And then, just as it seemed ready to run him down, the truck vanished. One moment, it was there, a hulking metal monster barreling toward him, and the next, it was gone, swallowed by the fog as if it had never existed. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the truck itself, leaving Jake standing alone, trembling, his heart thudding in his chest. "Get a grip, Jake," he muttered to himself, rubbing his face with shaking hands. This isn't real. None of this is real. But the sign, the truck, the voice on the CB radio, it was real. It was all horribly, impossibly real. Jake's thoughts were interrupted by another sound, this one soft, barely perceptible, like the whisper of wind through dead leaves. He turned slowly, dread pooling in his stomach. Figures were emerging from the fog. They were truckers, at least they had been once. Their clothes were ragged and torn, their skin pale and waxy, as if they had been drained of life long ago. Their eyes were hollow, empty, staring at Jake with an unnatural intensity. They moved slowly, deliberately, their feet dragging across the ground as they closed in around him. Jake took a step back, his mind reeling. Who are you?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The figures said nothing. They just stared at him, their eyes unblinking, their faces twisted in expressions of endless sorrow and torment. One of them, an older man with a long, scraggly beard and sunken eyes, finally spoke. His voice was a raspy whisper, like wind scraping across a grave. "We're like you," the man said, his words slow and deliberate. "Lost, trapped, forever." Jake shook his head, backing away as the figures inched closer. No, I'm not staying here. I'm getting out of here." The old trucker shook his head slowly, his empty eyes fixed on Jake. "There's no way out. Not once you've been marked." "Marked?" Jake's voice was barely audible now, his heart pounding in his chest. The old man raised a trembling hand and pointed at Jake's chest. Jake looked down and felt his blood run cold. On his chest, right over his heart, was a faint, glowing mark, an intricate symbol he had never seen before, burning faintly through his shirt. The trucker nodded slowly. "The road owns you now. You'll drive it, forever." Jake's mind screamed in denial, but deep down he knew the truth. The endless road, the ghost trucks, the truckers who had vanished without a trace, they were all part of the same terrible curse. He was one of them now, bound to this place, destined to roam the fog-shrouded highways for eternity. "No!" Jake screamed, backing away from the approaching figures. "I won't stay here. I won't." But as the fog thickened around him, and the ghostly figures drew closer, Jake knew there was no escape. The road had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before him. And like them, he would never leave. Now, on quiet, foggy nights, if you listen closely near the desolate highways, you might hear the